Some people run to the mountains to find themselves. Meritt Daws ran there to forget. For 11 years, the 59-year-old woman had lived alone in the Bitterroot wilderness, far from the life that broke her heart. Her days were simple: chop wood, mend the cabin, watch the seasons change. But one October morning, while gathering firewood, she found something that shouldn't exist. A traditional native shelter stood in a grove she'd walked through countless times. The fire was still warm, and carved into the wood was a name she hadn't heard in 40 years, Ronan, a name that belonged to someone who disappeared without a trace, taking answers she'd long stopped looking for. What was this shelter doing here? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like every other morning in the 11 years since Meritt Daws had made these mountains her refuge. She woke before dawn, as she always did, to the sound of silence so complete it had its own weight. No traffic hum, no neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls. Just the occasional creak of timber settling in the cold and the distant conversation of ravens greeting the day. She lay in bed for a moment, watching the grey light seep through the gap in her curtains, and did what she'd done every morning since the accident. She counted her breaths: 1, 2, 3, 4. By the time she reached 20, the tightness in her chest had loosened enough to let her sit up. By 30, she could stand. This was the rhythm of grief, she'd learned. You didn't conquer it. You just learned to breathe around it. The cabin was small but well built, constructed by her own hands over the course of 2 hard summers. 12 by 16 feet of solid lodgepole pine, chinked with moss and clay, a tin roof that sang in the rain. The wood stove in the corner held coals from the night before. She fed it kindling and waited for the fire to catch, her hands going through motions so familiar they required no thought. While the cabin warmed, she dressed in layers: long underwear, flannel shirt, wool sweater, canvas work pants patched at the knees, thick socks, broken-in boots that had walked 1,000 miles of these mountains. She braided her grey-streaked hair, the braid falling to the middle of her back, coarse and thick as it had been at 20. Some things didn't change, even when everything else did. Coffee came next. She ground the beans by hand in a small mill, boiled water on the wood stove, poured it through a simple filter. The first sip was always the best part of her day, bitter and hot and real. She drank standing at the window, looking out at the landscape she'd memorized in every season and mood. October had painted the Bitterroot Mountains in shades of rust and gold. The aspens glowed like torches against the dark green of the pines. Snow already dusted the higher peaks, and the smell in the air promised more to come. She'd need to finish stocking firewood soon. Another week, maybe 2, before the serious cold arrived. Her father's compass sat on the windowsill, catching the morning light. Brass and scratch, the kind surveyors had used before GPS made such tools obsolete. She picked it up out of habit, felt its familiar weight in her palm. He'd carried it everywhere during his years managing the family land, and when he died 2 years ago, it had been one of the few things she'd kept. Most of his belongings she'd donated or burned. The compass she'd kept because it reminded her of the few good times, him teaching her to read topographic maps, to follow property lines, to understand the language of elevation and watershed. The land itself had come to her in his will. 200 acres of forest and meadow, most of it steep and difficult, beautiful in the way that kept people at a distance. Her brother in Seattle hadn't contested it. He'd wanted nothing to do with their father's legacy, had built a life as far from Montana as he could manage while still remaining in the continental United States. They hadn't spoken in 5 years, not since the funeral, where they'd stood on opposite sides of the grave and exchanged the kind of polite, empty words strangers use. Meritt finished her coffee and rinsed the cup. The cabin was warm now, almost too warm, and she cracked the door to let in fresh air. The cold rushed in like it had been waiting, sharp and clean in her lungs. This was the medicine she needed. This was why she'd come here. Before the mountains, there had been another life. A husband, David, kind and steady. a high school teacher who coached basketball and knew the names of all his students. A daughter, Emma, 12 years old and bright as a new penny, who wanted to be a veterinarian and collected stray cats and fell asleep reading books about wolves. They'd lived in Missoula, in a blue house with a porch swing, and Meritt had guided wilderness trips for a local outfitter. She'd been good at it, teaching tourists how to read the forest, how to move quietly, how to see what was actually there instead of what they expected. Then came the accident. A drunk driver, an intersection, 3 seconds that erased everything. Meritt had been at work, leading a group up into the missions. She'd gotten the call on the satellite phone and hadn't believed it at first. Couldn't make the words mean what they meant. She'd stumbled down the mountain, left her group with another guide, driven through the night to a hospital where the chaplain met her at the door. That was when she'd known. They sent chaplains when there was no hope left to give. The grief had been like drowning in open water. No shore in sight, no bottom to touch. She tried to keep living in that blue house, but every room held ghosts. Emma's backpack by the door, David's coffee mug in the sink. She'd lasted 4 months before she understood she had 2 choices, leave or follow them into the dark. So she'd left. Sold the house, sold almost everything, and driven up into the Bitterroots with a truck full of tools and enough supplies to get started. Her father had been alive then, surprised but not displeased when she told him she was moving on to the far corner of the family land. He'd helped her that first summer, which was as close to reconciliation as they'd ever managed. They didn't talk about David and Emma. They talked about square footage and roof pitch and where to dig the well. Now he was gone too, and Meritt was alone in a way that felt permanent. But alone was manageable. Alone didn't require explanations or sympathy or the careful navigation of other people's discomfort with loss. Alone let her grieve at her own pace, which was to say slowly, maybe forever. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside. The air bit at her face, her breath visible in white puffs. The sky was that particular blue that only came in mountain country, deep and endless. A raven called from the ridge, and another answered. They were talking about something important, probably food. Ravens always had opinions about food. Her nearest neighbor was old Vernon Keeps the Fire, a Salish elder who lived 3 miles east on tribal land. They had an understanding. He didn't drop by unannounced, and she did the same. Once a month or so, she'd make the drive over with venison or whatever she could spare from her garden. They'd drink tea on his porch and talk about the weather, the wildlife, the slow changes in the forest. He told stories sometimes, old stories his grandfather had told him. Stories about the land remembering, about how certain places held onto what happened there like a scar holds onto a wound. Vernon had known her father, though not well. When she'd asked once what he'd thought of the man, Vernon had paused for a long time before answering. "Your father loved this land," he'd finally said, "but he loved it the way some men love things, wanting to own it completely. The land doesn't belong to anyone. We belong to it." She'd thought about that often since. Meritt walked to the woodshed, noting what needed attention. The roof had a couple loose shingles. The door sagged on its hinges. Small problems, easily fixed. She liked having problems she could solve with her hands. She pulled out the axe, tested its edge with her thumb, and selected a round of pine from the pile. The work was meditative. Lift the axe, swing, split, stack. Her body knew the rhythm, her muscles remembered. Sweat gathered despite the cold, and she worked until the pile of split wood reached her waist. Enough for a few days. She'd need more soon, which meant going deeper into the forest to find standing dead. Trees that had died on their feet and seasoned in place. The best firewood there was. She leaned the axe against the shed and looked out across her property. The cabin sat in a small meadow, ringed by lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. A creek ran along the southern edge, cold and clear, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. In summer, wildflowers covered the meadow, lupine and paintbrush and beargrass. Now in October, the grass had gone golden and brittle, waiting for snow. Beyond the meadow, the forest thickened. That was where she'd go today for firewood. There was a grove she had in mind, maybe 2 miles in, where several large pines had come down in a windstorm last winter. She'd been meaning to get to them, and today felt right. The weather was clear and she had time. She went back inside to pack her gear. A small backpack with water, matches, rope, a thermos of hot coffee, the axe and a folding saw, her father's compass, though she knew the way by heart. She strapped everything on, locked the cabin door, habit more than necessity, and headed into the trees. The forest closed around her like an embrace. This was her church, if she had one, the cathedral of pine and fir, the hymns of wind and water. She walked slowly, reading the ground as she went. Fresh elk tracks in the mud near the creek. Coyotes scat on a flat rock full of rabbit fur. A scrape on a tree trunk where a bull elk had rubbed velvet from his antlers. She followed a game trail that wound uphill through the trees, her breathing steady despite the elevation. At 59, she was in better shape than she'd been at 30. Hard work and clean air had given her a lean strength, and the mountains had taught her patience. She didn't rush. Rushing was how people got hurt out here. The grove was farther than she remembered, or maybe she'd just taken a different route without realizing it. The forest could do that, shift and rearrange itself in your memory. She checked the compass out of habit, oriented herself and kept walking. The morning sun slanted through the trees, golden and warm on her face. After another half hour, she found herself in unfamiliar territory. Not lost, she knew the general direction of the cabin, but in a part of the forest she didn't recognize. The trees were older here, their trunks massive and dark. The ground was thick with needles, and the air had a different quality, quieter somehow. That was when she saw it. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks. A structure stood in a small clearing ahead, partially hidden by low branches. She stopped walking, her hand instinctively going to the knife on her belt. Then she stepped closer, her breath catching. It was a lean-to shelter, built in the traditional native style her grandfather's generation would have called a wickiup. An A-frame of lodgepole pine lashed together with what looked like fresh cordage, covered with pine boughs that were still green. The construction was expert, each joint tight and purposeful. It hadn't been here the last time she'd walked this area. She was certain of that. Meritt approached slowly, her mind cycling through possibilities. Hunters sometimes built temporary shelters, though it was early for hunting season. Maybe teenagers looking for a place to party, though this was miles from any road. Maybe, she stopped. In the center of the shelter, just visible in the shadows, was a fire pit, and the ashes were still warm. She could see heat shimmer rising from them, smell the recent smoke. Her heart kicked up its pace. Someone had been here recently. Maybe was still nearby, but what froze her completely, what made the world tilt and her vision narrow, was what she saw carved into one of the support posts, a name, Ronan. She stumbled back, her hand pressed to her chest as if to hold her heart inside. The name hit her like a physical blow, dragging her 40 years into the past to a summer she'd spent decades trying to forget. Ronan. The warm ashes forgotten, the shelter forgotten. Meritt stood in the October cold and remembered a boy with dark eyes and gentle hands who'd taught her to track deer and had kissed her under stars that felt close enough to touch. A boy who disappeared one August morning without a word, without a trace, taking with him every answer she'd ever needed. His name, carved into fresh wood in a shelter that hadn't existed yesterday. Impossible. Meritt circled the shelter like a wolf circling prey, except she was the one who felt hunted. Her hands shook as she examined every detail, looking for something to make this make sense. The construction was flawless. Whoever had built this knew what they were doing. The poles were cut at precise angles, lashed with cordage that looked hand-twisted from bark fiber. The pine boughs overlapping the frame were fresh, still releasing their sharp scent into the air. This wasn't the work of amateurs or weekend campers. This was traditional craft, done right. She knelt by the fire pit and held her palm over the ashes. Warmth radiated against her skin, not hot enough to burn, but recently active. Within the last hour, maybe two, she scanned the clearing, looking for footprints, for any sign of who'd been here. The ground was disturbed, but in a strange way. No clear boot prints, no path leading in or out. Just compressed earth around the shelter and scuff marks that could have been made by anything. She found what might have been the impression of a moccasin near the fire, but it was so faint she couldn't be certain. Her breathing had gone shallow, her mind racing. She was miles from anyone, in a part of the forest she rarely visited, looking at something that shouldn't exist. And that name carved into the wood with careful, deliberate strokes. Ronan. She touched the carving with trembling fingers. The letters were fresh, the wood inside still pale where the blade had cut. She could smell the sap. This had been done recently, maybe this morning. The memories came whether she wanted them or not. She'd been 19, home from her first year of college, working for her father that summer to earn tuition money. He'd hired a young man from the reservation to help with some surveying work on the property boundaries. Ronan had been 22, quiet and serious, with knowledge of the forest that made her father's expertise look like a child's understanding. They'd worked together through June and into July, walking the property lines, marking corners, clearing sight lines. He'd taught her things her father never had, how to read game trails, how to find water by watching where birds flew at dusk, how to move through the forest without disturbing it. He'd shown her plants her people had names for, but no longer used, and he'd told her stories about the land that went back generations. By August, they were meeting in secret. Her father had made his opinions clear about appropriate company, and Ronan's family had their own concerns about him getting involved with a white girl whose great-grandfather had acquired land through methods nobody talked about but everyone remembered. They'd met at night, usually by the river that marked the eastern boundary of her father's property. They talked about everything, their dreams, their fears, their anger at the arbitrary divisions people drew between each other. She'd fallen in love with his gentleness, his certainty about who he was and where he belonged. He'd been the first person who'd ever made her feel like she could be herself without apology. Then, 3 days before he was supposed to finish working for her father, he'd simply disappeared. No goodbye, no note. His family, when she'd worked up the courage to drive to the reservation, had told her politely but firmly that he'd gone to stay with relatives in Oregon. They'd given her no other information. Her letters had gone unanswered. She'd spent that fall semester in a fog of confusion and hurt. By winter, she'd convinced herself it had been a summer romance, nothing more. By the following spring, she'd started dating the man who would become her husband. By the time she was 25, Ronan was a memory she rarely examined. Stored away with other youthful foolishness, but she'd never forgotten his name, and now here it was, carved into wood, in a shelter that appeared overnight like something from a dream. Meritt stood and backed away from the shelter, her mind spinning through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Was this some kind of message, a threat? Was someone trying to frighten her? Who even knew about Ronan? Her father was dead. Her brother had been too young to remember. Vernon might know some of it, but Vernon wasn't the type for games, unless Ronan himself knew. That was impossible. He'd be 62 now, if he was even alive. Why would he suddenly return after 40 years and build a shelter on her land without speaking to her? It made no sense. She took out her phone, then remembered she had no signal this deep in the forest. Not that she knew who she'd call anyway. The sheriff? And tell them what? Someone built a shelter and carved a name I recognize? They'd think she was crazy. Maybe she was crazy. Maybe grief and isolation had finally caught up with her, and she was seeing things that weren't there. Maybe the shelter had been here all along, and she'd just never noticed. Maybe the name was a coincidence, some stranger named Ronan who happened to camp here, but the ashes were warm. The boughs were fresh. The carving was new. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think practically. She needed to document this. She pulled out her phone and took photographs from every angle. The shelter itself, the fire pit, the carved name, the surrounding clearing. Her hands steadied as she worked, the familiar ritual of gathering information, calming her racing thoughts. When she'd taken enough photos, she stood still and listened. The forest was quiet but not silent. Wind moved through the high branches. A squirrel chattered somewhere in the canopy. Normal sounds, nothing human. She made a decision. She'd return to the cabin, gather proper camping gear, and come back to stake out this place. If someone was coming here regularly, she'd find out who and why. She wasn't afraid of the forest, and she wasn't going to be frightened off her own land by a mystery, no matter how unsettling. But as she turned to leave, something made her look back one more time. The shelter stood in its clearing, solid and real, smoke still rising faintly from the fire pit. And for just a moment, in the corner of her vision, she could have sworn she saw movement in the trees beyond, a figure watching from the shadows. She spun to face it fully, her hand on her knife. Nothing, just trees and filtered light and the slow sway of branches in the wind. Meritt stood frozen, her heart hammering, waiting for something to happen. But the forest remained still, offering no answers. Finally, she turned and walked quickly back the way she'd come. Forcing herself not to run, she marked the route carefully in her memory, noting landmarks. A lightning-struck snag, a boulder shaped like a bear's head, a distinctive cluster of 3 trees growing from a single root system. The walk back felt longer than the walk in. Every sound made her turn, expecting to see someone following. But when she finally emerged from the forest into her meadow, she was alone. The cabin looked exactly as she'd left it, solid and safe and ordinary. She went inside, locked the door, and sat at her small table with her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the edge to steady them. On the table sat her father's compass, catching the afternoon light through the window, and beside it, though she was certain she'd taken it with her, was a bundle of sweetgrass tied with a red thread. She stared at it, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. She'd left the cabin locked. No one could have, but someone had. Meritt picked up the sweetgrass with careful fingers. It was fresh, the scent strong and clean. Sweetgrass was sacred in Salish tradition, used in ceremonies for purification and blessing. Someone had been in her cabin and left this as a message. She stood abruptly, checking the rest of the small space. Nothing else was disturbed. Nothing taken. Just the sweetgrass, placed deliberately where she'd see it. Her hands found her phone. She scrolled to Vernon's number, hesitated, then set the phone down. What would she say? That she was being haunted by a name from her past? That someone was leaving her ceremonial plans? She needed to think, to understand, to figure out what was happening before she involved anyone else. That night, Meritt sat by her wood stove with all the lights off, watching the darkness outside her windows and listening to every sound. The sweetgrass lay on the table where she'd left it, and somewhere in the forest, a shelter stood that hadn't existed yesterday. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of a boy with dark eyes and questions she'd stopped asking 4 decades ago. Morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Meritt had dozed fitfully in her chair by the stove, jolting awake at every creak and settling, convinced someone was trying the door. But when dawn finally broke pale and cold through the windows, she was alone and untouched. She made coffee with hands that felt steadier than they had any right to be. The sweetgrass bundle still sat on the table, proof she hadn't imagined everything. She picked it up, smelled it again, then tucked it carefully into her jacket pocket. If someone was leaving her messages, she'd carry them. She'd show she wasn't afraid, even though fear sat like a stone in her stomach. Her pack was already prepared from yesterday's aborted firewood run. She added a few items, a tarp, her sleeping bag, extra water, trail mix she'd made last month with dried cherries and sunflower seeds. If she was going to watch the shelter, she'd need to be comfortable enough to stay for hours, maybe through the night. The camera was last. An old digital model David had bought her years ago for wildlife photography. She'd barely used it since the accident, but the battery still held a charge, and the memory card had space. Evidence. That's what she needed. Evidence that someone was coming to that shelter, and maybe evidence of who. She left the cabin as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, painting the frost-covered meadow in shades of orange and pink. Beautiful, the way October mornings were beautiful in the mountains. She tried to appreciate it, to let it ground her, but her mind kept circling back to impossible questions. The walk to the shelter felt different in daylight, less dreamlike and more real. She found her landmarks easily. The lightning-struck snag, the barehead boulder, the three-tree cluster. The forest was waking around her. A varied thrush called its haunting note. She saw fresh deer prints in a muddy patch, the doe heading downhill toward water. When she reached the clearing, she stopped at the tree line and studied everything before entering. The shelter stood exactly as it had yesterday. The fire pit looked cold now, though she'd checked to be certain. Nothing seemed different, but she approached cautiously anyway, alert for any signs she wasn't alone. The ashes were cold to the touch this time. She examined the shelter's interior, looking for anything she might have missed. A few scattered pine needles, a flat stone that might have been used as a seat. Nothing personal, no belongings left behind. Whoever had built this came and went without leaving traces beyond the structure itself. The carved name still made her chest tighten. Ronan. She ran her fingers over the letters again, memorizing their shape. The carving was deep, deliberate. This had taken time and care. This wasn't random vandalism or a thoughtless mark. Someone had wanted this name here, had wanted her to find it. She photographed everything again in better light, then searched the surrounding area in an expanding spiral. 20 yards out, she found something she'd missed yesterday, a game trail that showed recent use. Not just deer. The disturbed earth suggested something heavier, human-sized. She followed it for 50 yards until it intersected with another trail, then another. This part of the forest was crisscrossed with paths, most of them old and overgrown, but a few showing fresh passage. Meritt returned to the clearing and selected her observation point carefully. She needed a spot with clear sightlines to the shelter, but enough cover to remain hidden. She settled on a position behind a fallen log, about 40 yards from the clearing, screened by young pines. From here, she could see anyone approaching from 3 directions, and the 4th direction led uphill into rocky, difficult terrain that nobody would choose as an access route. She spread the tarp over the damp ground, set out her sleeping bag as insulation, and arranged her pack so she could access water and food without much movement. The camera she set on a small tripod aimed at the shelter. Then she settled in to wait. Waiting was something she knew how to do. Years of guiding hunters had taught her patience, the ability to sit motionless for hours while the forest forgot you were there. She let her breathing slow, her body relax. She became part of the landscape, just another element among the trees. Hours passed. The sun climbed, and the temperature rose enough that she unzipped her jacket. A Clark's nutcracker worked the pine cones in a nearby tree, extracting seeds with methodical efficiency. 2 ravens flew over, conversing in their complex language. Once she heard something large moving through the brush downhill, but it never came close enough to see. Probably an elk. Her mind wandered while she watched. She thought about Ronan, letting herself remember what she'd kept locked away for so long. His laugh, which had been quiet and surprising. The way he'd moved through the forest, so economical and sure. His hands, which had been careful with everything, plants, tools, her. He'd told her stories that summer. Stories his grandfather had told him about the land before it was divided and fenced. About a time when his people had moved freely through these valleys, following the seasons and the game. He'd shown her grinding stones in creek beds where women had processed camas root, had pointed out trails worn smooth by centuries of use, now overgrown and forgotten by everyone except the animals. She remembered asking him once if it made him angry. What had been taken? He'd been quiet for a long time before answering. "Anger is easy," he'd finally said. "Anger burns hot and feels powerful. But anger doesn't heal anything. My grandfather taught me that we honor what was lost by remembering it correctly, by teaching it forward. The land doesn't forget, even if people do." She'd loved him for that wisdom, that refusal to let bitterness consume him. She'd been young enough to think love could overcome everything, cultural divides, family disapproval, history's weight. Young enough to believe that if 2 people cared enough, nothing else mattered. Then he'd left. And she'd learned that sometimes love wasn't enough at all. The afternoon light was starting to slant golden through the trees when she saw it. Movement at the far edge of the clearing. Meritt's body went rigid, every sense focusing on that spot. She reached slowly for the camera, adjusting the zoom as quietly as possible. A figure emerged from the trees, just for a moment, just long enough for her to register a shape. Medium height, wearing dark clothing, moving with purpose toward the shelter. Then they stopped, still mostly hidden by shadows, and seemed to be looking directly at her hiding place. Her finger froze on the camera's shutter button. Could they see her? She hadn't moved, had barely breathed. But something had made them pause. The figure reached up and hung something from the shelter's entrance. She couldn't see what from this distance. Then before she could react, before she could take a single photograph, they melted back into the forest as silently as they'd appeared. Meritt waited, her heart pounding, for any sign they'd return. 5 minutes, 10, nothing but wind and bird calls. Finally, she stood on shaking legs and approached the shelter, hanging from the entrance. Tied with the same red thread as the sweetgrass was a small leather pouch. She took it down with trembling hands and opened it carefully. Inside was loose tobacco, traditional and ceremonial, and beneath it, something that made her breath stop entirely. A photograph, faded and worn but unmistakable. Herself at 19, laughing, standing next to Ronan by the river. She'd thought this photo was lost decades ago, had assumed it was thrown away or destroyed. Someone had kept it all these years. And now they were giving it back. Meritt sat in her truck outside Vernon Keeps the Fire's place, the photograph clutched in her hand, trying to find the courage to knock on his door. The 3-mile drive from her cabin had been automatic, her hands steering, while her mind reeled through implications and questions she couldn't answer alone. Vernon's homestead was a blend of old and new. A traditional log house with modern solar panels on the roof. A satellite dish mounted next to a sweat lodge. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady grey column, and his old Ford pickup sat in the driveway. So she knew he was home. She'd thought about calling first, but her phone still had no signal out here. And besides, this wasn't a conversation for phones. This required looking someone in the eye and asking them to tell her the truth about things she'd spent 40 years avoiding. Finally, she got out of the truck and walked to the porch. Before she could knock, the door opened. Vernon stood there in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, his long grey hair pulled back in a ponytail. He was 73, his face deeply lined, but his eyes sharp and clear. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded as if he'd been expecting this visit. "You'd better come in," he said. "I'll make tea." His home was warm and cluttered in a comfortable way. Books lined shelves built into every wall. Photographs covered the surfaces, family, friends, gatherings. A beautiful Pendleton blanket hung on one wall, and eagle feathers stood in a vase by the window. Everything smelled like sage and wood smoke, and the kind of life that was lived fully and without pretense. Meritt sat at his kitchen table while he filled a kettle and set it on the stove. She laid out the photograph, the leather pouch, the bundle of sweetgrass. Physical evidence of something she still couldn't quite believe. Vernon glanced at the items, but didn't touch them. Instead, he prepared the tea with careful attention, measuring loose leaves, warming the pot, timing the steeping. Only when he'd poured 2 cups and sat down across from her did he speak. "Tell me," he said simply. So she did. She told him about finding the shelter, about the carved name, about the warm ashes and the photograph. She told him about the sweetgrass appearing in her locked cabin, about watching the clearing and seeing the figure who'd left the tobacco pouch. She told him everything except the part where her voice shook and her hands trembled, though he surely noticed both. When she finished, Vernon was quiet for a long time. He sipped his tea and looked out the window at the mountains, thinking in the way older people think, taking time to arrange thoughts properly before speaking them. "You know about the land?" he finally said. It wasn't quite a question. "My father's land." "My land now." "Your great-grandfather's land," Vernon corrected gently. "Acquired in 1923 through means that were legal at the time, but not honorable. You know this, even if nobody spoke of it directly. She did know it, in the way you know things you've chosen not to examine too closely. Her great-grandfather had been a surveyor who'd worked for the county during a period when reservation boundaries were being redrawn, always smaller, always less favorable to the tribes. Land had changed hands in transactions that looked official on paper, but rested on coercion, manipulation, and the systematic dismantling of tribal sovereignty. The section where you found the shelter, Vernon continued, that was never supposed to be part of your family's holdings. It was guaranteed to the Salish in the 1855 treaty. But boundaries got moved. Markers got relocated. Documents got lost or rewritten. By the time anyone challenged it, decades had passed, and the court said possession was 9/10 of the law. Meritt's chest felt tight. My father knew this? Your father knew? His father knew. They chose to keep quiet about it, to hold on to what they had. Vernon's voice was gentle but firm. I'm not telling you this to shame you, Meritt. You didn't make those choices. But the land remembers, and some debts get carried forward whether we want them or not. She looked down at the photograph of herself at 19, standing next to Ronan, both of them young and unaware of the weight of history they were standing on. Tell me about Ronan, she said quietly. Vernon's expression softened. Ronan was my cousin's grandson, good boy. Smart, thoughtful, knew the old ways and wanted to learn more. His grandfather was one of the elders pushing for the land return through legal channels. Quiet work mostly. Filing claims, gathering documentation, building a case that might take generations to win. And my father? Your father was frightened. Not of losing all the land, but of the precedent. If one parcel got returned, others might follow. He saw the relationship between you and Ronan as a threat, thought maybe if you married, the boy would have legal standing to challenge the claim. So he made sure Ronan left. The room seemed to tilt. How? Vernon sighed. Your father went to Ronan's uncle, made threats about challenging the family's fishing rights, about making trouble for tribal members who worked in town. Small threats, but effective. Then he offered a deal. If Ronan left and never contacted you again, your father would stop fighting the quiet legal work the tribe was doing, would let the claims move forward without interference. Meritt felt like she'd been struck. Ronan left to protect his family? Ronan left because he was 22 years old and someone he loved was being used as a weapon. He didn't want you caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with the two of you, and everything to do with choices made before either of you were born. She pressed her hands against her face, breathing hard. All these years, she'd thought he'd abandoned her, that she hadn't mattered enough. And instead, he'd loved her enough to walk away from what they'd had. Why didn't anyone tell me? Would you have believed them? Would you have forgiven your father while he was alive? Sometimes, Vernon said carefully, people keep secrets because the truth would hurt more than the silence. She wanted to argue with that, but couldn't. If someone had told her at 19 why Ronan had really left, what would she have done? Confronted her father? Run away with Ronan? Forced him to choose between her and his family's well-being? Maybe the silence had been a mercy, even if it had felt like abandonment. Where is he now? She asked, though part of her was afraid of the answer. Vernon's face told her before his words did. Ronan passed 3 months ago. Cancer. He lived in Spokane most of his life, worked for the Tribal Forestry Service, taught traditional skills to young people. Never married. His daughter, from a relationship years later, Sage. She's a lawyer, works on tribal sovereignty cases. Brilliant woman. She's been building the case for the land return for the past 2 years. Meritt's mind raced, connecting pieces. The shelter. Sage built it? I imagine so. Or someone working with her. The land where it stands, that's the disputed section. Right on the boundary line your great-grandfather moved. But why? Why not just contact me directly? Why this elaborate? Vernon smiled slightly. Because she's her father's daughter. She knows some conversations need to happen in the right place, in the right way. The shelter's an invitation, Meritt. And the items she's leaving, those are traditional approaches. Sweetgrass for purification. Tobacco as an offering. The photograph to show she knows the story, knows what was lost. What does she want from me? I think she wants you to understand what happened. And then she wants you to choose what comes next. Meritt stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had been her refuge and her prison for 11 years. All this time, she'd thought she was running from grief over David and Emma, but maybe she'd also been running from the uncomfortable weight of a legacy she hadn't asked for but couldn't escape. The land should be returned, she said quietly. That's what you're saying. I'm saying the land was never really taken in any way that honors how we're supposed to live with it. Whether it gets returned legally or not, that's complicated. But whether you acknowledge the truth of how your family came to have it, that's simple. She turned to face him. I want to meet her, Sage. I want to talk to her. Vernon nodded. I thought you might. I can let her know you're ready. But Meritt, he paused, choosing his words carefully. This won't be easy. The conversation you need to have isn't just about land or history. It's about what you're willing to let go of, what you're willing to carry forward. I know, she said, though she wasn't sure she did. She gathered the items from the table, the photograph, the sweetgrass, the tobacco pouch. Vernon walked her to the door, and before she left he placed a hand on her shoulder. Ronan spoke of you sometimes, in the years before he passed. He never stopped wondering what life you'd built, whether you were happy. He'd be glad you're asking these questions now. The tears came finally, hot and unexpected. Meritt wiped them away roughly. I wasted so much time being angry at the wrong things. You've got time now, Vernon said gently. Use it better. She drove home in the gathering dusk, the photograph on the seat beside her. When she reached her cabin, she built a fire in the wood stove and sat at the table with her. Father's journal, the one she'd inherited along with the land and had never quite been able to throw away. She opened it for the first time in 2 years and began reading his careful, cramped handwriting, looking for the truth she'd been avoiding, looking for the man behind the father she'd thought she knew. By the time the fire burned low and the night pressed dark against the windows, she understood far more than she wanted to about what people convince themselves is necessary, and how easy it is to protect what you have at the expense of what's right. 3 days of reading her father's journals left Meritt hollow and angry in ways she hadn't known were possible. The man who emerged from those pages was careful, calculating, and convinced his actions were justified. He'd written about protecting the family, legacy, and maintaining what previous generations had built, as if those phrases absolved him of every manipulation and threat he'd deployed. The entry from August 1985 was the worst. She'd read it a dozen times, hoping the words would somehow change. Spoke with Joseph today about his nephew. The boy's smart enough to know this won't end well if he persists. Made clear the consequences. Not threats, just reality. Sometimes protecting those we love means making hard choices. Meritt will be upset initially, but she's young. She'll forget him and find someone suitable. Better a temporary heartbreak than a lifetime of complications. Temporary heartbreak. As if love could be measured in convenience. As if her feelings were something to be managed like property boundaries or timber rights, but that wasn't even the revelation. That had sent her tearing through the cabins, floorboards in the old bedroom where her father had slept. During his final visits, in the last year of his life, her father's entries had changed. The confident justifications gave way to something that might have been regret, though he'd never quite named it that way. References to settling accounts and making things right before it's too late appeared with increasing frequency. The final entry, written just weeks before his death, was brief. Lockbox buried at Eastern Marker. Deed transfer prepared. Let her decide. Meritt had spent the last 2 days searching for that lockbox. She checked every corner marker on the property, dug around the survey stakes, followed fence lines until her hands were raw and her back screamed. Nothing. Now, standing in the old bedroom with the loose floorboards exposed, she examined her father's compass more carefully. She'd been carrying it by habit, but something about that last entry made her reconsider. Eastern Marker could mean a property corner, but her father had been a surveyor. Markers meant something specific to men like him. She held the compass up to the afternoon light streaming through the window and noticed what she'd somehow missed in 11 years of handling it. The brass casing had tiny scratches around the edge, deliberate marks. They weren't random wear. They were calculations, bearing measurements. Her father had been clever. The compass itself was the marker, She grabbed a topographic map of her property and spread it on the floor, then carefully aligned the compass with true north. The scratched measurements gave her a bearing, not to the property corners she'd been checking, but to somewhere else entirely. Following the line on the map, her finger stopped at a spot near the eastern boundary of the property. An old stone foundation, marked on the survey from the 1930s, remnants of a cabin that had burned down decades before she was born. The sun was already low, but she couldn't wait. She grabbed a shovel, a flashlight, and the compass, then headed into the forest at a near run. The foundation was farther than she'd thought, almost 2 miles from her cabin, in a part of the property she rarely visited. The forest was thick here, and the old homestead site had nearly been reclaimed by nature. Crumbled stones poked through layers of moss and pine needles, marking where walls had once stood. She used the compass to take bearings from the foundation's corners, checking and rechecking her measurements. On the third try, following a bearing that led northeast from the back corner, she found a depression in the ground, about 30 feet from the ruins. Not natural, too regular, too deliberate. Meritt started digging. The soil was soft from autumn rains, and within 20 minutes her shovel hit something solid, metal. She cleared the dirt away with her hands, uncovering a waterproof steel box about the size of a small cooler. It was heavy, locked with a combination dial she recognized, the same kind her father had used on his filing cabinets. She tried the obvious combinations. His birthday, her mother's birthday, the year he'd bought the land. Nothing worked. Then, on impulse, she tried the date Ronan had left. August 17th, 1985. The lock clicked open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and plastic, were documents. She pulled them out carefully, afraid they might crumble despite the protection. The first thing she saw was a surveyor's map from 1923. Yellowed and brittle but meticulously preserved. It showed the original treaty boundaries. And it showed exactly where those boundaries had been deliberately altered. Her great-grandfather's handwriting marked the changes in red ink. Notes about relocated monuments and corrected descriptions that made her stomach turn. This wasn't careless record-keeping or honest mistakes. This was documented fraud, preserved as if her great-grandfather had been proud of his cleverness. Beneath the map were photographs. Her great-grandfather with county officials, money visibly changing hands, letters between her grandfather and father, discussing how to maintain the adjustments and discourage inquiry. A paper trail of deliberate deception spanning 3 generations. And at the bottom, a manila envelope containing something recent. She opened it with shaking hands, a land deed transfer form partially filled out. Her father's handwriting dated just 6 months before he died. It would transfer the disputed section, roughly 60 acres, back to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. His signature was there. A notary's seal was there, but the tribal representative's signature line was blank. He'd prepared everything, then stopped. Never completed the transfer. Never sent it. Never told anyone it existed. Tucked beneath the deed was a letter in her father's handwriting, addressed to her. Meritt, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've figured out my poor attempt at a treasure hunt. I was never good at direct communication. Your mother used to say I treated feelings like engineering problems. I won't insult you by asking forgiveness. What I did to you and that boy can't be undone. What my father and grandfather did to acquire this land can't be excused. I spent my life protecting something that was never ours to keep. I tried to make this right at the end. Prepared the transfer, contacted the tribal council through back channels. But I couldn't finish it. Cowardice, probably. Or the last gasp of pride from a stubborn old man who couldn't quite let go. So I'm leaving the choice to you. The land is yours now. Do with it what conscience demands. I've left you the truth, the whole ugly truth. Whether that's a gift or a burden, I suppose you'll decide. Your father, who loved you better than he showed, and worse than you deserved. Meritt sat back against the old foundation stones as darkness gathered around her. In her hands, she held documented proof of 3 generations of theft. She held her father's incomplete attempt at redemption. She held the power to complete what he'd started or to bury it all again, and pretend she'd never found it. The easy choice was obvious. Keep quiet. Keep the land. It was legally hers. The statute of limitations had run out on any criminal charges decades ago. No court would force her to give up property she'd inherited legally, no matter how it had been acquired originally. But sitting there in the near dark, surrounded by the ruins of an old homestead built on stolen ground, Meritt understood something her father had apparently learned too late. The legal choice and the right choice weren't always the same thing. She packed everything carefully back into the lockbox and carried it home through the darkness, using the compass and her flashlight to navigate. By the time she reached her cabin, her decision was made. She would complete what her father had started. But first, she needed to understand who she'd be giving it back to. She needed to meet Sage Whitepath and hear the full story from someone who had more claim to this land than her family ever had. She pulled out her phone and sent Vernon a text message, knowing he'd see it in the morning. "Tell her I'm ready. I'll meet her at the shelter. Noon tomorrow." Then she sat at her table and looked at the photograph of herself and Ronan, 19 and 22, and unaware that the ground they were standing on was already pulling them apart. "I'm sorry," she whispered to that long-ago boy. "I'm so sorry I didn't know. But I know now, and I'm going to try to make it right." Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the windows. In the distance, a wolf howled, long and lonely and fierce. Another answered from a different ridge, then another. The pack was talking to itself, maintaining connections across the dark. Meritt listened until the howling faded, then went to bed and slept better than she had in weeks. Morning arrived clear and cold, the kind of October day that promised winter wasn't far behind. Meritt woke early and prepared for the meeting with more care than she'd given to anything in years. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, but this mattered in a way that required respect. She wore clean jeans and a good wool sweater, her warmest jacket. She braided her hair and secured it with a leather tie Ronan had given her 40 years ago. One of the few things of his she'd kept, buried in a drawer she rarely opened. Her hands shook slightly as she tied it, but she made herself finish the task. The lockbox sat on her table, along with her father's journals and the photograph. She packed everything carefully into her backpack, along with the sweetgrass and tobacco pouch. These were the elements of the conversation she needed to have: truth, history, and the ceremonial acknowledgement that this was about more than just legal documents. Vernon had texted back late last night with a simple confirmation. "She'll be there." So will I. She was grateful he'd be present. Whatever happened today needed a witness who understood both worlds, the legal reality and the deeper truth of what was being negotiated. At 11:30, Meritt locked her cabin and began the walk to the shelter. The forest felt different today, less ominous and more expectant. The same trails, the same trees, but charged with possibility rather than mystery. She reached the clearing 15 minutes early and found Vernon already there, seated on a flat rock near the shelter, drinking from a thermos. He nodded when he saw her but didn't speak. This wasn't the time for casual conversation. Meritt set down her pack and studied the shelter again, seeing it with new eyes. It wasn't just a structure. It was a statement, a reclamation of presence, built with traditional knowledge on land that had been taken through legal manipulation. Someone had constructed this with care and skill, honoring old ways in a place that had tried to forget them. At precisely noon, a figure emerged from the tree line. The woman was in her mid-50s, Meritt guessed, though she carried herself with a certainty that made age irrelevant. She was tall and lean, with long dark hair showing threads of silver, pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore hiking pants and a canvas jacket, sturdy boots. But what stopped Meritt's breath was her face. The resemblance to Ronan was striking. The same high cheekbones, the same strong jawline, the same dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. Looking at her was like looking through a window into a past Meritt had tried to forget. The woman approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. When she spoke, her voice was measured and clear. "I'm Sage Whitepath. Thank you for meeting me." Meritt found her voice. I'm Meritt. Though I suppose you already know that, a slight smile. I do. I know a lot about you, though we've never met. That's probably uncomfortable. I apologize for the mystery, for the indirect approach. It seemed important to do this properly. Vernon stood and performed a brief blessing, burning sage and speaking in Salish. Neither woman interrupted. When he finished, he nodded and stepped back, making it clear this conversation belonged to them. Sage reached into her jacket and pulled out a worn leather bag. This was my father's medicine bag. He carried it for most of his life. Before he died, he gave it to me and told me about you, about the summer you spent together, about why he left. She opened the bag and began removing items one by one, laying them on a flat stone between them. Each object felt like a wound being reopened and simultaneously beginning to heal. A pressed wildflower, dried and fragile. "From your meetings by the river," Sage said quietly, a wooden carving of two eagles in flight, their wings overlapping. "He carved this the week after he met you. Said it was how being with you felt, like flying, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Every letter you sent, he kept them all, read them until he'd memorized them, and finally a small ring, silver with a simple turquoise stone. He bought this with the last paycheck from your father. Was going to ask you to marry him. Then everything changed." Meritt pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Each item was evidence of a love she'd thought was one-sided, proof that she'd mattered to him in all the ways she'd needed to believe. "Why didn't he ever contact me?" she managed to ask. "Later, I mean. After enough time had passed." Sage's expression was gentle but honest. "By the time he felt enough distance had opened up, you were married. He saw the announcement in the paper. He told me he was happy you'd found someone, that you deserved a good life. He carried guilt about leaving you without explanation, but he never regretted protecting you from being used in a fight that wasn't yours." "It should have been my fight too," Meritt said fiercely. "I should have had a choice. You're right. You should have. But our fathers, yours and mine, made different calculations about what mattered most. Your father wanted to protect land and legacy. Mine wanted to protect you and his family from becoming weapons against each other." Sage paused. "I'm not sure either of them got it completely right," Vernon spoke up quietly. "Men of that generation, they thought they had to carry everything themselves. Didn't know how to share the weight." Meritt pulled the lockbox from her pack. "I found this 3 days ago. My father left it for me." She opened it and showed Sage the map, the photographs, the letters, the documented evidence of how the land had been stolen. Sage examined everything carefully, her expression unchanging but her hands growing tighter around the papers. "I've been building a legal case for 2 years, Sage said finally. "Gathering evidence, establishing precedent, working with the tribal council. We've been trying to do this through proper channels, to prove the fraud and force a return. But evidence like this, original documents in your great-grandfather's handwriting, this changes everything. With this, the case becomes undeniable." "There's more," Meritt said, pulling out the partially completed deed transfer. "My father prepared this before he died. He was trying to make it right. He just couldn't finish it." Sage took the document and read it carefully, her eyes widening slightly. "This is a voluntary transfer. If this had been completed, the land would already be back with the tribe. No lawsuit necessary, no lengthy legal battle." "I want to complete it," Meritt said. The words came out stronger than she'd expected. "I want to finish what he started." Sage looked at her for a long moment. "Do you understand what you're offering? This is 60 acres of valuable land. Timber rights, water access, development potential. You'd be giving up significant assets." "I'd be returning what was never mine to keep," Meritt corrected. "There's a difference." Vernon made a soft sound of approval. Sage set down the deed and sat back. "I need you to understand something. This isn't just about my father or your father or what happened 40 years ago. I've spent years working on tribal sovereignty cases. I've seen what happens when indigenous communities try to reclaim what was taken. It's exhausting, expensive, and often unsuccessful. The legal system that enabled the theft in the first place isn't eager to undo it. So why do it?" Meritt asked. "Because someone has to. Because every acre returned is a step toward justice. Because my children's children deserve to inherit something more than stolen land and broken promises. Sage's voice intensified. But I don't want this return to be charity. I don't want you feeling noble about giving back what should never have been taken. I need to know you understand the full weight of what you're offering. Meritt met her eyes. I spent 11 years hiding in these mountains, running from grief, building walls, convincing myself that isolation was the same as peace. Finding that shelter, learning the truth about my father and Ronan, it broke something open. I can't go back to pretending I don't know. And I can't keep land that my family acquired through fraud just because the legal system says I can, even if it costs you. I've already lost everything that mattered, Meritt said quietly. My husband, my daughter, years of my life to grief and avoidance. The land is just land. It doesn't love me back. It doesn't make me whole. And it was never really mine. I've just been holding it for a while. Sage's eyes glistened. My father would have liked hearing you say that. There's something else, Meritt continued. I want to understand what returning this land would mean. Not just legally, but practically. What would happen to it? How would it be used? Sage pulled out her phone and showed Meritt a presentation she'd prepared. The tribal council has plans. This section borders the reservation and connects two important watersheds. The vision is to create a wilderness education center, teaching traditional knowledge, offering programs for tribal youth, providing space for cultural ceremonies. It would honor traditional use while serving future generations. The images showed classrooms, simple cabins, teaching circles, places where knowledge could be passed down and culture could be practiced openly. I want to be part of it, Meritt said suddenly. Not in charge, it's not my place to lead. But I know this land. I've lived here for 11 years. I know the trails, the weather patterns, the wildlife. I could help. If you'd let me, Sage smiled, the first real smile since she'd arrived. That would be fitting. You could help build something that honors what was lost and create something new. Vernon stood and approached, placing a hand on each woman's shoulder. This is good. This is how healing happens, not through courts or documents alone, but through people choosing to do better than those who came before them. The three of them stood in the clearing as afternoon light filtered through the pines, and Meritt felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for longer than she could remember. They'd been talking for over an hour, working through details and possibilities, when Sage reached into her jacket again and pulled out a cell phone. It looked out of place in the clearing, this modern device among the traditional shelter and ceremonial items. There's something else, Sage said, her voice carrying a new weight. Something I haven't told you yet. Something that changes this conversation in ways I'm not sure you're prepared for. Meritt felt a flutter of unease. What do you mean? Sage held up the phone. There's a video I need you to watch. My father recorded it about a month before he died. He knew his time was limited, and he wanted to make sure certain truths got told, even if he wasn't around to tell them himself. She propped the phone against a rock, angling it so Meritt could see the screen clearly. Then she pressed play. Ronan's face filled the small screen, and Meritt's breath caught. He was older, 61 in the video, his hair completely silver, his face lined by time and illness. But his eyes were the same, and his voice when he spoke was the voice she remembered from 40 years ago, just roughened by age and sickness. Hello, Meritt, the video began. If you're watching this, then Sage found you, and you've been willing to listen. That takes courage. Thank you. He paused, gathering strength, and Meritt realized he'd been very ill when this was recorded. The camera showed him sitting in a chair with a blanket across his lap, sunlight coming through a window behind him. I want to tell you why I left, Ronan continued. Not the version your father told you, if he told you anything at all, but the truth. Your father threatened my family, not with violence, but with legal and economic pressure we couldn't afford to fight. He made it clear that my relationship with you would cost my uncle his fishing rights, would bring scrutiny to tribal members working in town, would create problems we couldn't solve. Meritt felt tears streaming down her face. But she didn't wipe them away. I was 22 and stupid enough to think leaving would solve everything. That if I disappeared, your father would back off and you'd be protected from the ugliness. I wrote you letters explaining everything, dozens of them, but I never sent them. Convinced myself you'd be better off hating me than knowing you'd been used as leverage." He stopped to cough, and someone off camera, Sage, probably handed him water. "That's not the hardest part to tell you, though. The hard part is what happened next." Meritt felt Vernon move closer, sensing something significant was coming. "6 months after I left," Ronan said, "I came back. Just once. I'd been living in Spokane, miserable and angry, and I convinced myself I needed to confront your father one final time. Tell him exactly what I thought of him. Get it out of my system so I could move on." He looked directly at the camera, his eyes full of old pain. "I drove to Montana in November 1986. Went to your father's house when I knew he'd be home. We had it out, every angry word I'd been holding. He told me you were engaged by then, moving on with your life. Said I'd done the right thing by leaving. I was so furious I could barely see straight." Another pause, longer this time. "I went to a bar in Missoula that night. Started drinking, which I didn't do often. There was a woman there, also drinking, also angry at the world. We talked. One thing led to another." He closed his eyes. "I don't remember her name. I'm ashamed to say that. But 9 months later, a social worker contacted my family. There'd been a baby, a boy. The mother had given him up for adoption. She listed my name as the father, though we'd never exchanged last names. The tribal registry helped them track me down." Meritt's mind was spinning, trying to process what she was hearing. "By the time I found out, the adoption was already finalized. The records were sealed. I was told the baby had gone to a good home, and the best thing I could do was let him have a stable life without complications from a birth father he'd never know. So I did. I let him go, like I'd let you go. Convinced myself it was the noble choice." Ronan's voice broke slightly. "I've thought about that boy every day since. Wondered what he looked like, what kind of person he became, whether he ever wanted to find me. But I never searched for him. Never tried to force my way into his life. Another choice I made that maybe wasn't as noble as I told myself it was." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity visible even through illness. "Here's the part that matters for you, Meritt. 3 years ago, Sage did one of those genealogy DNA tests. She was concerned about hereditary health conditions, wanted to know what to watch for. The results came back with something unexpected, a half-sibling match. 50% genetic overlap with someone in the system." Meritt looked at Sage, who nodded slowly. "We started investigating," Ronan continued, carefully, respectfully. "Found out the half-sibling was a man named Cole, 38 years old at the time. He'd been searching for his birth family, had done the DNA test, hoping to find connections. Sage reached out, they met, and Cole told us something that made everything even more complicated." Ronan paused for so long that Meritt thought the video might have frozen. But then he spoke again, and his words changed everything. Cole had already been searching for his birth family through traditional channels. He'd managed to get some non-identifying information from adoption records, and he'd discovered something about his birth mother. Not her name, but her family circumstances at the time of his birth. She'd been young, in college, from a wealthy Montana family. She'd been coerced into giving him up by her parents, who thought an unexpected child would ruin her life. Meritt felt cold spreading through her body. Cole kept digging, used ancestry databases, searched old college records, followed every thread he could find. And eventually, about a year ago, he figured it out. His birth mother's name. Ronan looked directly at the camera. "He's your nephew, Meritt, your brother's son. The baby your brother's college girlfriend was forced to give up in 1987. The clearing seemed to spin." Meritt gripped the edge of the rock she was sitting on, trying to steady herself. "So when Sage came to me with her plan to approach you about the land," Ronan continued, "it wasn't just about correcting historical injustice. It was about family. My son and your nephew are the same person. Cole carries both our bloodlines. He's connected to this land through both sides, through the people it was taken from and the people who took it." Ronan's expression softened despite his obvious Exhaustion. I'm telling you this because Cole wants to meet you. He's been learning about his Salish heritage, trying to understand where he comes from. He knows about you, about your brother, about the complicated history that connects us all. And he's asked Sage to arrange a meeting if you're willing. He coughed again, harder this time, and the video flickered as someone adjusted the camera. I won't be there for that meeting, Meritt. The doctors have given me weeks, maybe a month. But I want you to know, I never stopped caring about you. You were the best part of that summer, the part I carried with me through everything else. If I could go back and make different choices, I would. But I can't. All I can do is tell you the truth now and hope it helps somehow. His eyes were wet. And so were Meritt's. The shelter Sage built. It's on the exact boundary line your great-grandfather moved. It's a memorial and a meeting place and an invitation. Cole helped build it, learning traditional techniques. He wanted to create something that honored both sides of his heritage. Even though those sides have been in conflict for generations, Ronan paused, seeming to gather his final thoughts. I hope you can forgive me for leaving without explanation. I hope you can forgive your father for the choices he made. Not because they were right, but because holding on to anger only poisons the person carrying it. And I hope you can meet Cole and see in him what I see, the possibility that something good can come from all this mess, that connections can be rebuilt. That family isn't just about blood or history, but about choosing to care for each other despite everything. He lifted his hand in a small wave. Goodbye, Meritt. I loved you then. Part of me loves you still. Thank you for listening. The video ended. Meritt sat in silence, her mind trying to absorb everything she'd just learned. Cole, a nephew she'd never known existed. Her brother's son, given up for adoption 38 years ago. Ronan's son, both of them, connected by a single night of grief and anger and loneliness. Sage spoke quietly. Cole is here, in Montana. He's been staying with Vernon for the past week, learning, preparing for this. If you want to meet him, he's waiting about a quarter mile from here. I asked him to give us time to talk first, to let you process all of this before. I want to meet him, Meritt said immediately. The words came without thought, straight from someplace deeper than logic. Now please, Sage pulled out her phone and sent a text. Then she looked at Meritt with an expression that was part sympathy, part apology. I'm sorry this is so much. I thought about telling you gradually, easing into it. But there's no gentle way to say, by the way, you have a nephew you've never met, who's also my half-brother, and whose existence connects our families in ways that go beyond the land dispute. Vernon chuckled softly despite the tension. Sometimes the truth has to come all at once or not at all. They waited in silence. Meritt's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. A nephew. Family she'd thought was limited to a brother she hadn't spoken to in 5 years. And not just any nephew, one connected to Ronan, to this land. To everything that had been broken and might now be healed. Movement at the tree line made her look up. A man emerged from the forest, walking with careful respect, as if approaching something sacred. He was tall and lean, probably in his late 30s, with dark hair and features that were an interesting blend. Ronan's cheekbones and nose, but eyes that were lighter, more like her brother's. He wore jeans and a work shirt, hiking boots worn soft with use. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and uncertain. Aunt Meritt. The title hit her like a physical thing. Aunt, she'd been a mother once, but never an aunt. That role had been stolen along with so much else when her brother's girlfriend was forced to give up this child. Cole? Her voice cracked. He moved closer, and she could see now that he was nervous, his hands shoved in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing for rejection. I don't want to intrude, he said. I know this is a lot. Sage told me everything might be too much, that you might need time. I can go, come back another day if... Don't you dare, Meritt said fiercely, standing. Don't you dare leave. She closed the distance between them in 4 strides and pulled him into a hug before she could think better of it. He stiffened in surprise, then slowly relaxed, his arms coming around her carefully, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed this. I'm sorry, she said into his shoulder. I'm so sorry you were given up. Sorry you grew up without knowing us. Sorry for all of it. You didn't know, Cole said quietly. Nobody told you. How could you be sorry for something you didn't know about? She pulled back to look at him properly. Because you deserved better than secrets and separation. You deserved family. His eyes were wet. I had good foster parents. It wasn't all bad. But yeah, I always wondered. Always felt like there was something missing. Finding Sage, learning about my father, discovering I had an aunt who... He stopped, emotion choking off the words. Who loves you already, Meritt finished. Because you're family, and because you're Ronan's son, and because looking at you is like seeing all the possibilities that should have been. They stood there in the clearing, this aunt and nephew, who'd been kept apart by choices other people made, while Sage and Vernon watched with quiet satisfaction. Finally, Cole stepped back and gestured to the shelter. I helped build this. Sage taught me the traditional methods. It felt important, you know, learning how to do things the way my father's people did them, connecting to that part of myself. It's beautiful, Meritt said. When I first found it, I thought I was losing my mind. He smiled, tentative but genuine. Sorry about that. Sage thought the mystery approach would work better than just showing up at your door. Something about meeting on neutral ground, in a sacred way. She was right, Meritt admitted. If you'd just knocked on my cabin door and explained all this, I probably would have shut the door in your face. I've gotten good at shutting people out, Vernon told me, Cole said carefully. About your husband and daughter, I'm sorry for your loss. The old grief stirred, but gentler than usual. Thank you. They would have liked you, Emma especially. She was always collecting strays and looking for family connections. She would have been thrilled to have a cousin. I have a cousin? Cole looked startled. Had, Meritt corrected softly. She died 12 years ago. She was 12. You would have been 26. Understanding crossed his face. I'm sorry. That must have been... He stopped, recognizing there were no adequate words. It was, Meritt agreed simply. Sage stepped forward. I think we should talk about next steps. What this all means, practically. Cole has been learning about his heritage, but he wants to be part of the solution here. Part of making things right, Cole nodded. The Wilderness Education Center Sage described. That's something I want to be involved in. I've been working construction the past 15 years, building houses, commercial projects. I could help build something meaningful here, something that honors both sides of who I am. Both sides, Vernon said thoughtfully. The people whose land was taken and the family who took it. You carry both truths, which makes him perfect, Meritt said slowly, to help bridge the gap. To be part of returning this land and creating something new on it. She looked at the three of them, Sage, Cole, Vernon, 3 people who'd been strangers a month ago and were now standing at the center of something that felt like destiny, or at least like the possibility of healing. I want to do this properly, she said. Complete the deed transfer, return the land, be part of building the education center. And I want Cole to be central to it all. This is his inheritance as much as anyone's, maybe more so. Cole's expression was overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. Say you'll help, Meritt replied. Say you'll let me get to know you. Say you'll teach me about the traditions Sage has been teaching you. And say you'll consider moving to Montana permanently, because I've spent 11 years alone, and I'm tired of it. He laughed, surprised and genuine. I can say yes to all of that. Vernon stood and performed another blessing, marking the moment. When he finished, he looked at each of them in turn. The land brought you all together. It's been holding this story, waiting for the right time to tell it. Now it's told, and now you get to choose what comes next. This is how healing happens, not perfectly, not easily, but honestly. As the afternoon light turned golden through the trees, the 4 of them began making plans that would change everything. The next week moved with the kind of momentum that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Meritt found herself at the center of something larger than she'd anticipated, and for the first time in years, she wasn't running from it. The first challenge came that evening, after Cole and Sage had left, and Meritt sat alone in her cabin with her phone in her hand. She'd been staring at her brother's contact information for 20 minutes, trying to find the courage to make a call she should have made years ago. Finally, she pressed the button. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice wary. "Meritt?" "David." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "I need to talk to you about something important." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that she thought he might hang up. "Then what's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. But I found someone, and you need to know." She told him everything. About the shelter, about Sage, about the land, and her father's incomplete redemption. And then, taking a breath, she told him about Cole. The silence that followed was different this time. Heavier. When her brother finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "His name is Cole Whitepath. He's 38. He's been looking for his birth family for years. David, he wants to meet you." Her brother's breathing was ragged over the phone. "I think about him every day, every single day for 38 years. His mother, Jessica, she wanted to keep him. But our parents, they said it would ruin her life, ruin my future. We were 20. We didn't know how to fight them." "I know," Meritt said gently. "Cole knows too. He's not angry. He just wants connection. Does he look like me?" "A little. More like his father, but your eyes." "Definitely your eyes." David made a sound that might have been a sob. "I need to meet him." "When? How?" "Come to Montana. This weekend if you can. We need to do something together anyway, something that involves all of us." She explained about the land transfer, about the plan to create the Wilderness Education Center, about finishing what their father had started. David listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Dad tried to make it right," he finally said. "That's more than I expected from him." He couldn't finish it. "We need to do that together." "I'll be there Saturday morning," David said. "And Meritt, thank you for calling, for finding Cole, for not shutting me out completely." "I'm tired of shutting people out," she admitted. "It doesn't actually protect anyone." After they hung up, Meritt sat in the darkness and cried, not from grief this time, but from the strange lightness of letting go of anger she'd carried for so long. The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. Sage brought legal documents that needed reviewing. Vernon helped coordinate with the tribal council, who needed to formally accept the land transfer and approve the education center plans. Cole came by the cabin daily, sometimes to work on logistics, sometimes just to talk and get to know his aunt. Meritt learned that he'd spent his childhood in foster care, bouncing between families who meant well but weren't equipped for a kid with questions about identity and belonging. He'd aged out of the system at 18, worked construction to pay for community college, and built a decent life through sheer determination. But there'd always been an emptiness, the not knowing where he came from, who his people were. Finding Sage changed everything, he told Meritt on the 3rd day, as they sat on her porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. "She gave me history, context. A father I never met but could understand through her stories, and then she told me about you, and I realized I had more family than I'd thought." "Possible. I'm sorry we didn't find you sooner," Meritt said. "You didn't know I existed. My father didn't even know until I was already adopted. It's nobody's fault, just the way things happened." He paused. "Though your father and grandfather, the land thing, that's different. That was deliberate." "Yes," Meritt agreed. "That was deliberate, and returning it is deliberate too. That's important." They'd been working on plans for the education center, sketching ideas on paper spread across her kitchen table. Cole had experience with construction, and his insights were practical and valuable. He'd suggested using traditional building methods where possible, blending them with modern safety standards. Solar power, water collection systems, structures that would last but remain in harmony with the landscape. "This could be really beautiful," he'd said, his pencil moving across the paper. "A place where kids learn about the forest the way my father learned it from his grandfather. Where traditional knowledge gets passed down alongside modern science. Both are important. Both are valid." Meritt watched him sketch, seeing Ronan in the careful way he approached the work, and felt a bittersweet ache. Ronan should be here for this, should see what his son was becoming. But maybe, in some way that went beyond the physical, he did know. Maybe that video he'd recorded was his way of being present for this transformation. On Friday, Vernon came by with news from the tribal council. They'd approved the transfer pending a formal ceremony. The council wanted to honor the moment properly, not just as a legal transaction, but as a spiritual and cultural reclamation. They want to do it at the shelter, Vernon explained, where this all started. They'll bring elders, perform traditional blessings, acknowledge what was lost and what's being restored. It's important that this happens publicly, so the community witnesses it, so younger generations see that justice delayed isn't justice denied. When? Meritt asked. 2 weeks. They need time to prepare, to make sure the right people can attend. And they want your brother there too. He's part of this story, whether he meant to be or not. Saturday morning, Meritt stood at the edge of her property, watching a car navigate the rough dirt road toward her cabin. Her brother climbed out, looking older than she remembered, but fundamentally the same. 54 now, graying at the temples, carrying the weight of a life lived with regrets he'd never quite shaken. They stared at each other for a moment, then embraced, awkward and genuine and long overdue. "I've missed you," David said. "I've missed you too. I didn't realize how much until now." Cole arrived an hour later, and Meritt watched her brother meet his son for the first time since the day he was born. David approached slowly, his hands shaking, and when he finally stood in front of Cole, the resemblance was undeniable. "Hi," David said, his voice breaking on the single syllable. "Hi, Dad," Cole replied, and David crumpled. They held each other while Meritt stood back and let them have the moment. She'd had her reunion. This was theirs. Vernon, standing beside her, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Good work," he said quietly. "You brought them together." "The land brought them together," she corrected. "I just stopped standing in the way." That afternoon, the four of them, Meritt, David, Cole, and Vernon, walked to the shelter. Sage met them there, and together they discussed the ceremony that would happen in 2 weeks. The tribal council would bring 50 or more people. There would be drumming, singing, prayers in Salish and English. The deed transfer would be signed publicly, witnessed by elders and recorded properly. "It's going to be emotional," Sage warned. "For everyone. The tribe has been fighting for land returns for generations. This is a victory, but it's also a reminder of everything that's still outstanding. Some people will be grateful. Others might be angry it took so long. You need to be prepared for complicated reactions." "I understand," Meritt said. "This isn't about anyone feeling grateful to me. It's about doing what should have been done a century ago." David spoke up, his voice uncertain. "What's my role in this? I inherited nothing from Dad. I don't own any of the land. But I feel like I should, I don't know, acknowledge something. Apologize somehow." "You'll be there," Vernon said. "That's important. You'll witness your sister completing what your father couldn't, and you'll be introducing your son to his heritage on both sides. That matters." Over the next week, preparations intensified. The tribal council sent representatives to survey the land and begin planning for the education center. Architects volunteered their services. Cole threw himself into learning everything he could about traditional Salish construction methods, spending hours with Vernon and tribal elders who were willing to teach. Meritt watched him transform before her eyes. The uncertain man who'd emerged from the forest 2 weeks ago was becoming someone solid and purposeful. He was finding not just family, but identity, understanding where he came from and what he might contribute to the future. She worked alongside him when she could, learning the same skills. They stripped bark together for cordage. They practiced lashing techniques. They listened to stories from elders about how buildings were traditionally oriented, how spaces were organized, how the forest provided everything needed if you knew how to ask properly. "This is what my father wanted," Cole said one evening, as they sat by the shelter watching the sunset. "For me to know this, to be connected to it. Sage told me he talked about it a lot in his last weeks, hoping I'd find my way here to this knowledge." "He'd be proud of you," Meritt said. "I hope so. I think about him constantly. Wish I'd had a chance to meet him, to thank him for—" Cole gestured vaguely at everything around them. "For all of this." for giving me roots, even though he wasn't there to plant them. Meritt understood that longing, that grief for someone you'd never known but somehow missed anyway. She'd felt it with Emma every day since the accident, missing not just who her daughter had been, but who she would have become. "He knew you existed," Meritt said. That mattered to him. You mattered to him. The day before the ceremony, Meritt stood in her cabin surrounded by everything she'd prepared. The lockbox with all the documents, her father's journals, the photograph of her and Ronan, the deed transfer completed now with Sage's help, ready for final signatures. She thought about the woman who'd run to these mountains 11 years ago. Broken and desperate and convinced isolation was the same as healing. That woman had been wrong. Healing required connection, required facing truth, required choosing to be part of something larger than personal grief. Tomorrow, she would stand in front of 50 witnesses and return land that had never been hers to keep. She would acknowledge centuries of harm. She would complete her father's incomplete redemption and begin building something new from the wreckage of old injustices. It wouldn't fix everything, wouldn't undo the past or restore what had been lost, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, she was learning, were powerful things. She slept that night with the windows open, listening to the forest prepare for transformation. The morning of the ceremony arrived clear and cold, the kind of November day where frost painted every surface and breath hung visible in the air. Meritt woke before dawn, her body too charged with nervous energy to sleep longer. She dressed carefully in clothes Vernon had helped her select, simple but respectful, honoring the solemnity of what was about to happen. By 9 o'clock, people began arriving. Tribal members came in small groups, some traveling from the reservation, others from homes scattered across western Montana. They brought drums and blankets, folding chairs and thermoses of coffee. The clearing where the shelter stood transformed into a gathering place, people arranging themselves in a loose circle around the structure that had started everything. Meritt stood to the side with David and Cole, watching the assembly grow. She recognized some faces from her years of living here, people she'd seen in town, at the gas station, at the feed store. Others were strangers, but they all carried the weight of this moment in their posture and expressions. The tribal elders arrived together, Vernon among them, moving with deliberate dignity. They wore traditional regalia, some with beaded vests, others with woven blankets draped across their shoulders. One elder carried a staff carved with symbols Meritt didn't know, but could sense the meaning of continuity, memory, endurance. Sage appeared at Meritt's elbow, dressed in a beautiful buckskin dress with intricate beadwork. "Are you ready?" Meritt's mouth was dry. "I think so. As ready as I'll ever be. Remember, this isn't about you being a hero. This is about acknowledging truth and choosing to correct it. You don't need to say much. The act speaks for itself." A drum began to beat, slow, steady, matching a heartbeat. Other drums joined in, creating a rhythm that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Meritt felt it in her chest, in her bones, in the way her breath synchronized to the pulse. The elders formed a circle around the shelter, and Vernon stepped forward to speak. He addressed the gathering in Salish first, his voice carrying across the clearing with authority and warmth. Then he switched to English, his words careful and measured. "We gather here on land that was taken from our people through fraud and coercion over a century ago. This land holds the memory of that injustice. It also holds the memory of everything that came before. Generations of our ancestors who lived here, harvested here, held ceremony here. The land remembers, even when we're forced to forget." He gestured to the shelter. "This structure was built by Ronan's daughter and son, Sage and Cole, as both memorial and invitation. A way of saying the past is not finished with us yet. A way of calling for healing that goes beyond legal documents and property lines." Vernon turned to Meritt. "Meritt Daws has chosen to complete what her father could not, returning this land to its rightful stewards. This is not charity. This is not forgiveness for wrongs that cannot be undone. This is simply doing what should have been done long ago. We honor her choice while acknowledging it should never have been necessary. He motioned for Meritt to step forward. Her legs felt unsteady, but David and Cole moved with her, flanking her on either side. The three of them stood before the assembled group. 3 generations of the family that had held stolen land, now choosing to let it go. Meritt's hands shook as she pulled out the deed transfer documents. Her voice, when she found it, was quieter than she'd intended, but it carried in the morning stillness. I stand here today to acknowledge that my great-grandfather acquired this land through fraudulent means, that my grandfather and father knew this and chose to keep quiet, that I inherited both the land and the responsibility to make things right. She held up the documents. This deed transfers 60 acres back to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. It's not enough. It doesn't undo the past or restore everything that was taken. But it's what I can do now today. And I do it not as a favor, but as an obligation, as the bare minimum requirement of living with integrity. One of the elders, an old woman with silver hair braided down her back, stepped forward. She wore a blanket decorated with geometric patterns in deep reds and blues. When she spoke, her voice was surprisingly strong for someone who must have been 90 years old. We accept this land return. We acknowledge the courage it takes to admit when your family's prosperity was built on others' suffering. We commit to using this land in ways that honor all who came before, the ancestors who walked here first, and the possibility that future generations might do better than those past. She reached out and placed her hand over Meritt's hand, holding the documents. Thank you for choosing truth over comfort. Meritt's vision blurred with tears. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry my father couldn't do this himself. He took the first steps, the elder said gently. You're taking the final ones. That's how change happens, slowly, imperfectly, but forward. Sage stepped forward with a representative from the tribal council, a younger man in his 40s wearing a suit and traditional bolo tie. He produced a tablet with the official transfer documents loaded, ready for electronic signatures. The ceremony was blending old and new, traditional and modern, finding a way to honor both. We'll sign together, Sage explained. You transferring the land, the council accepting it on behalf of the tribe. Vernon and 3 tribal elders will witness. Your brother and Cole will also sign as witnesses, acknowledging their family connection to this history. Meritt nodded and took the stylus Sage offered. Her hand was steadier now, the initial nervousness giving way to determination. This was right. This was necessary. Whatever came next would be built on a foundation of truth rather than lies. She signed her name carefully, then watched as Sage signed, then the council representative, then Vernon and the 3 elders. David signed with a shaking hand, his face wet with tears. Cole signed last, his signature firm and clear, a man claiming his place in a story that had tried to erase him. When it was done, the elder woman raised her hands and began to sing. Others joined her, voices blending in a song Meritt didn't understand, but felt deeply. The drums picked up the rhythm, and the singing grew louder, more joyful. The singing continued, as the tribal council member carefully saved the signed documents and forwarded them to the county recorder's office. The legal transaction was complete, but the ceremony was far from over. This was about more than paperwork. It was about marking a transformation, about the land changing hands in a way that honored both practicality and spirit. Vernon approached the shelter with burning sage, moving around its perimeter in a blessing that cleansed and claimed. Other elders followed with sacred herbs, their movements deliberate and purposeful. They were marking the space, declaring it returned, acknowledging its significance. Meritt watched, feeling the weight of history shifting. This clearing had held secrets and lies for over a century. Now it held truth. The shelter Sage and Cole had built stood as a bridge between what had been lost and what might be created. She thought of Ronan, of how he'd taught her to see the forest differently that long-ago summer, how he'd shown her that the land held memory and knowledge if you learned to listen. He would have wanted to be here for this. The thought brought grief, but also gratitude that his children were here to complete what he'd started by loving her, by leaving to protect her, by carrying questions about identity and belonging until they'd finally found answers. The elder woman who'd accepted the transfer approached Meritt again, this time carrying 2 eagle feathers. She held them up for the gathering to see. "These feathers represent courage," she announced. "Not the courage of warriors in battle, but the courage it takes to admit wrong and choose differently. The courage to let go of what you thought was yours when you learn it never was." She placed 1 feather in Meritt's hand. "For choosing truth over inheritance, for completing your father's unfinished work, for opening yourself to connection instead of hiding in isolation." Then she turned to Sage and placed the 2nd feather in her hands. "For searching for justice not through anger, but through careful work. For honoring your father by finishing what he couldn't. For building bridges instead of walls." Both women held the feathers carefully, understanding their weight and meaning. Around them, the gathering erupted in approval. Not applause exactly, but vocalizations of support and acknowledgement. People called out in Salish and English, their voices blending into affirmation. Cole stepped forward, looking uncertain but determined. "May I say something?" The elder woman nodded, and the crowd quieted. "I'm new to all of this," Cole began, his voice carrying despite his nervousness. "New to knowing my father's people, new to understanding my heritage. But I've learned something these past weeks. Family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to show up for each other. It's about doing the work to heal what previous generations broke." He gestured to Meritt and David. "My aunt and father, my birth father, they're doing that work. And I want to be part of it. I want to help build the education center that's planned for this land. I want to learn traditional skills and pass them forward. I want to honor both sides of who I am, the people this land was taken from and the family who took it, by being part of making it right." His voice strengthened. "I don't know if I'm saying this correctly. I'm still learning the proper ways, but I'm grateful to Sage for finding me, to Vernon for teaching me, to my aunt for choosing this path, and to my father, wherever he is, for giving me the gift of questions that led me here." This elder woman smiled. "You speak well, and you're welcome here, not as a stranger, but as someone returning to a place you never knew but always belonged." Vernon moved to Cole's side and placed a hand on his shoulder. "This young man has been learning fast. He's got his father's patience and his aunt's determination. He'll do good work here." The ceremony moved into its final phase. Food was brought out. Fry bread, venison stew, salmon that had been prepared traditionally. People gathered in small groups, eating and talking, the formal solemnity giving way to something more communal and warm. Children who'd been sitting still through the ceremony now ran between the trees, their laughter a promise of continuity. Meritt found herself surrounded by people thanking her, but also sharing their own stories. An old man told her about his grandmother who'd walked this land before the boundaries were redrawn. A younger woman explained how her children would benefit from the education center, learning skills that had nearly been lost. A teenager asked if he could volunteer to help build, wanting to be part of something that honored his ancestors. David stood with Cole, the 2 of them talking quietly. Father and son, separated for 38 years by choices neither of them had made, now finding their way toward connection. It was awkward and genuine and necessary. Meritt watched them and felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of grief she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. Sage approached with 2 cups of coffee. "You did good today." "We did good," Meritt corrected. "All of us together. My father would be pleased. This is what he wanted, not revenge, not bitterness, but actual healing. The kind that costs something, but creates something better." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the gathering. The drums had started again, quieter now, just a background rhythm. Some people were dancing, not formally, just moving to the beat, celebrating in a way that felt earned. Vernon appeared beside them. "The council wants you to know something, Meritt. They're going to name the education center after Ronan. It'll be called Ronan's Place, a memorial to a man who understood that the land and its people can't be separated." "That taking one harms both." Meritt's throat tightened. "That's perfect. He would have... She couldn't finish. He would have been humbled, Sage said quietly, and proud, especially seeing Cole here, being part of it all. As the afternoon wore on and people began to leave, many stopped to embrace Meritt, to offer words of encouragement, or simply to acknowledge her presence. She'd expected some anger, some resentment for how long this had taken, but what she received instead was acceptance tinged with relief. This was one piece of justice in a long struggle. One step forward after too many steps back, the last to leave were the elders. They gathered around the shelter one final time, offered prayers that Meritt felt more than understood, and then departed with a dignity that made her chest ache. These were people who'd carried the weight of displacement and loss their entire lives, who'd watched sacred land become someone else's property, who'd never stopped fighting, quietly and persistently, for what was right. Finally, only Meritt, David, Cole, Sage, and Vernon remained in the clearing. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The shelter stood solid and purposeful, no longer a mystery, but a monument. "What happens now?" David asked. "Now we build," Cole said. "The center, the programs, the connections. We turn this land into something that serves the future instead of protecting the past." Meritt nodded. "And I keep learning. Vernon's already offered to teach me more about traditional plants and medicines. Sage is connecting me with tribal historians. I want to understand what this place was before my great-grandfather's theft. What it meant to the people who lived here. That's good work," Vernon said approvingly. "Understanding leads to respect. Respect leads to right relationship." They stood together as darkness gathered, 5 people bound by blood and choice and the land that had brought them together. The shelter behind them was no longer an impossible mystery, but a testament to what happened when people chose truth over comfort, connection over isolation, healing over holding on. Meritt looked at her nephew, this gift she hadn't known existed until a month ago, and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. Emma and David were gone, but Cole was here. Family continued. Love found new forms. "Thank you," she said to all of them. "For patience, for teaching me, for not giving up on the possibility that things could change," Sage smiled. "Thank you for being willing to change. Not everyone would have." As they walked back toward the vehicles, leaving the shelter to stand watch through the night, Meritt touched the eagle feather tucked carefully into her jacket pocket. She would keep it always, a reminder of the day she'd chosen to complete an unfinished redemption and discovered that letting go could feel like coming home. 3 months had passed since the ceremony, and January's deep cold had settled over the Bitterroot Mountains. Meritt stood at her cabin window, watching fresh snow fall in the kind of silence that only winter brings. She sipped her morning coffee and felt something she'd almost forgotten. Contentment that wasn't just the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. The legal transfer was complete. The county had recorded the deed. The 60 acres now officially belonged to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and planning for Ronan's place was well underway. Architects had drawn up plans that blended traditional and modern design. Fundraising had exceeded expectations, with donations coming from environmental groups, educational foundations, and individuals who'd heard the story and wanted to support the work. Cole had moved to Montana permanently, living in a small cabin near Vernon's place. He came by Meritt's property almost daily, and they'd fallen into an easy routine. Some mornings, they'd have coffee together and talk about the education center's progress. Other times, they'd work in companionable silence, processing firewood or maintaining trails. He was teaching her traditional carving techniques. She was teaching him the wilderness survival skills she'd spent decades perfecting. The relationship between Cole and his birth father, David, was growing too, though more carefully. They spoke on the phone weekly, and David had visited twice more, staying in town and meeting Cole for long conversations over meals or walks in the forest. It was awkward sometimes, the weight of 38 lost years sitting between them. But they were trying, and trying mattered. Meritt had also begun reconnecting with David in ways they hadn't managed since childhood. They'd started sharing family stories, filling in gaps in each other's understanding of their parents and grandparents. Some of those stories were painful, confirming that the land theft hadn't been the only moral compromise their family had made. But honesty, even difficult honesty, felt better than the careful silence they'd maintained for years. This morning, Meritt was preparing for her monthly visit to the shelter. It had become a ritual, skiing in with supplies, checking the structure, leaving offerings of tobacco or sweetgrass. The shelter had become a gathering place for others too. Ronan brought tribal youth there to teach traditional skills. Sage visited when she was in Montana, using the space for quiet reflection. Even strangers occasionally left tokens, feathers, stones, handwritten notes thanking the land for its patience. She strapped on her cross-country skis and glided through the forest, following a route that was familiar now, almost meditative. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches bowed under the weight. A raven called from somewhere in the canopy, its voice sharp and clear in the cold air. When she reached the clearing, she found Cole already there. He'd been working on adding a carved panel to the shelter's interior, images of eagles and rivers and mountains, traditional symbols rendered with remarkable skill for someone so new to the craft. "Morning, Aunt Mer," he called, using the nickname he'd given her. "Morning. That's beautiful work." He stepped back to examine the carving critically. "Vernon says I'm getting better. Still have a long way to go to match the old masters, but I'm learning." She set down her pack and pulled out the items she'd brought, fresh pine boughs to replace the old ones. Tobacco wrapped in red cloth, a thermos of hot coffee to share. "I was thinking," Cole said as he helped her work, "about what this place means. Not just the shelter, but all of it. The land, the education center, the story that brought us all together. What about it? I think my father knew something important. That healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about remembering it correctly and then choosing what comes next. The land can't forget what was done to it, but it can be part of something better going forward." Meritt nodded slowly. "Your father was wise. I wish I'd understood that when I was younger. You understand it now. That's what matters." They worked together until the shelter looked fresh and cared for, then sat inside, sharing the coffee. The space felt sacred, not because it was ancient or unchanged, but because it had become a place where transformation happened, where Meritt had first encountered the mystery that would crack open her carefully constructed isolation, where documents were signed and land was returned, where family found each other after decades of separation. "Sage called last night," Cole said. "Groundbreaking for the education center is scheduled for April. She wants us all there. You, me, Vernon, David, the tribal council. A whole ceremony to mark the beginning of construction. I'll be there," Meritt promised. "Wouldn't miss it." She also said something else. "Something about you." Meritt raised an eyebrow. "What about me?" "She wants you to be part of the teaching staff when Ronan's place opens. Not leading anything, she was clear about that, but sharing your wilderness skills, working alongside tribal educators. She said you have knowledge that's valuable, and you've earned the right to contribute." Meritt felt tears prick her eyes. "I'd be honored." I told her you'd say yes. They finished the coffee and prepared to leave, but Meritt paused at the entrance to the shelter. She pulled out a carving tool she'd been carrying, and with Cole watching, carefully added her name beneath Ronan's on the wooden frame where his name had been carved months ago. Not replacing his mark, but adding to it, claiming her place in the story. "Meritt Daws," she carved in simple letters. "And beneath it, the year 2025, Cole smiled. "Perfect. You belong here too." As they skied back toward the cabin, the sun broke through the clouds, turning the snow-covered forest into something luminous. Meritt felt warmth despite the cold, the kind of warmth that came from connection rather than isolation, from purpose rather than hiding. At the cabin, smoke rose from her chimney where she'd left the fire banked. Lights glowed in the windows. Inside, she knew, was the photograph of her and Ronan, displayed now on her mantel instead of hidden in a drawer. Next to it was a picture of Cole and Sage, and one of Emma and David from before the accident. Family in all its complicated forms, the mountains remained her home, but they were no longer her prison. The grief over David and Emma would never completely disappear, but it had transformed into something she could carry without being crushed by its weight. She thought of them often, wondering what they'd think of these changes, and believed they'd be pleased. Emma would have loved having a cousin. David would have understood why returning the land mattered. Tomorrow, she was meeting with a group of tribal youth Cole was mentoring, teaching winter survival skills. Next week, Vernon was starting lessons on traditional plant medicines. The month after that, the planning committee for Ronan's place was meeting to finalize curriculum and staffing. Her calendar was full in ways it hadn't been for 11 years. And the fullness felt right. Meritt hung up her coat, fed the fire, and stood at the window watching the afternoon light fade. The shelter was out there in the forest, keeping watch. The land that had held secrets for so long was beginning to heal. And she, 59 years old, scarred by loss but no longer defined by it, was finally truly home. Some mysteries, she'd learned, didn't resolve with simple answers. They resolved with acceptance, with change, with the willingness to let the past inform the future without dictating it. The shelter had appeared like an impossible gift, leading her through anger and revelation and grief to something that looked like peace. She thought of Ronan, wondering if somehow he knew what his daughter and son had accomplished, what his death had set in motion. She hoped he did. Hoped he understood that the love they'd shared at 19, though it had ended badly, had planted seeds that bloomed decades later into healing. "Thank you," she whispered to the memory of him. To the forest, to whatever force had brought them all together, outside. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky. A wolf howled in the distance and another answered. The pack was singing, maintaining connections across the dark, and Meritt Daws, no longer running, no longer hiding, listened to the music of the wild and knew she was exactly where she needed to be.